Hello everybody. In this video lecture we are going to do the poem Background Casually by one of the most prominent Indian English poet, Nissim Ezekiel. This poem is one of the longer poems by the poet. It is of 75 lines, and even though it is a simple worded poem just like all of the poems by Ezekiel, yet it has a very profound theme. And the most important thing about this poem is that it it is autobiographical. It tells us a lot about the poet's life, his thoughts, his struggles, and his wish to identify and find a place in the country of his birth, that is India. So we are going to do this and analyze this poem line by line. First of all, let us look at some of the important points as an introduction. This poem was published in 1965 individually and later in the collection of poetry Hymns in Darkness, which was published in 1976. As I told you, it is autobiographical in nature, and you can say confessional also, because the poet actually opens out his heart to the reader and expresses what he really feels about um, throughout his life, how his childhood was, and as he grew up, how he identified with his country. The structure of the poem again is very important. That is why we are discussing it even before we start reading the poem. So in the as I told you, it is a poem of 75 lines written in free verse, which means that there is no rhyme scheme. The poet has really not tried to give any kind of rhythm, as in many of Ezekiel's poem. That is his style. He gives a very dry and a very bland kind of a rhythm to the poem, no musicality, and it is written in free verse. And the most important thing is that he has divided it into three sections. As I have written down here in the next 3 points, the 75 line poem is divided like this. The first 20 lines, line number 1 to line number 20, this is section number 1, and this section basically deals with the childhood of the poet and his experiences as he grew up right from his birth. Line number 21 to line number 60 deals with it is called section number 2, and it deals with the adult life of the poet. He was a young man, how he went out of the country to study. He went to London. He had his education, but somehow life in that country also, outside India also, did not really go down well with him, and he returned to his country, which means he returned to India, and then how he fared. Line number 61 to 75 is section 3 of the poem, which deals with the old age. Old age is a time when one can reflect back to how a person's life has been. And so we see that this is this section number 3. This is the smallest section, as you can see, and it tells us about what conclusion he has drawn from his life. The major theme of the poem. Now this is important, that why do we believe that this poem is confessional, and how, as an autobiographical sense, the poet has given us a glimpse of his inner mind, because as a theme, this poem depicts the poet's search for belongingness. How does he belong in India? How does he feel in India? Does he feel like he is an integral part of this country? Does the country accept him? Because if you compare with the other majorities, maybe you say Hindus and some other religions like the Muslims and Christians, Jews number really small. They are a minuscule percentage of India's population. And so his Jewish background, his Jewish birth, his Jewish parentage is what makes him ask for or make him seek his belongingness. In India also, he feels like an alien so many times. He is not treated like an Indian. And when he goes out of India, even there he is a foreigner, because he by birth he comes from India. So where does he really belong? Which place can he call his own? And the next point is the way he tries to find an identity here. Ultimately, he does consider India as his country, and we can say that it is a love-hate relationship, but it is a relationship which he carries, which he depicts, which he tries to portray in all his works. It has been said that even though sometimes we find Ezekiel using the very ironical, mocking kind of a tone, but he shares a very special relationship with the country, and in almost all of his works he shows that relationship, he depicts that relationship, and that is most important. So after this slide we are going directly to the lines of the poem, text of the poem, and we are going to discuss it minutely. A poet, rascal, clown was born. So right from the very first sentence of the first stanza, we see how it is the third person narrative which begins, which means that obviously the poet is talking about himself, and it is a tone of self-mockery. You can call it a tone of self-banter also, where what he is doing, he is actually making fun of himself and calling himself a rascal and a clown, and he has started right from the time of his birth. As we have discussed earlier that this is autobiographical, so he begins with the time of his birth. This is the first section, as I had told you that it is divided into three sections. So from here the section 1, the first section begins, and you will see in the first section he is narrating right from his birth and the process of his childhood, the experiences of his childhood. So the poet says, a poet, rascal, clown was born, the frightened child who would not eat or sleep, a boy of meager bone. So he calls himself a frightened child who would eat very less, and he would also sleep very less. So he had all kinds of problems in childhood, right from problems of emotional kind. So these are the emotional problems he's dealing with, where he remains afraid all the time, he does not eat and sleep properly, and that makes him a boy of meager bone, which means he has a very weak body also. So these are some of the physical and emotional aspects of Ezekiel as a child. And he says he never learned to fly a kite. Now see, flying a kite, and his borrowed top refused to spin, and spinning a top, टॉप वी ऑल नो हिंदी में लट्टू कहते हैं जिसे. सो ही डज नॉट नो हाउ टू फ्लाई अ काइट एंड how even to spin a top, and it is not it would not amaze you, because all children in India, these are their favorite pastimes, to fly a kite and to spin a top. But the poet says if you look at it at the literal level, it can mean that he could not enjoy the games of childhood, the pastimes of childhood that every child did, maybe because he did not have company, maybe because he did not have any friends or anybody to play with him. That is on the literal level. But if you look at it at the metaphorical level, it can also mean here the kite and the spinning top can be metaphors of freedom. Just like a child enjoys being free, we hear from the very first stanza, we realize that Ezekiel is telling us that he did not have the freedom of a child. We can say the happiness that comes with childhood that was missing from his life. So what are the things we have come to know? That right from the beginning he had these emotional issues where he was afraid, he was frightened. He is a boy of meager bone, which means a weak body also, and he does not really go out much to fly a kite or spin a top, and he lacks freedom. Moving on to the second stanza. I went to Roman Catholic school, a mugging Jew among the wolves. And now he has grown up and he has gone to school and he goes to a Christian school. Now, we had discussed in the initial introduction also that he himself is a Jew, and he had to go to a Christian school because did not have and do not have schools for Jews separately, because Jews are a very scant minority. They are so less in number that you would not find special schools for the children of the Jews. So he attended the Christian school, and here he says, I felt as if I was among the Jews. Among the wolves. And why does he say that he was among the wolves? Because all the other children appeared to be wolves to him, because they bullied him. We know what is the meaning of bullying and ragging. These are things which children do experience in school time, in college time. Especially children who are very weak and who are frightened, those children are bullied much more. So we already know that he is a child, a very weak child of meager bone, and he looks frightened also. So he was bullied by children. What is the other reason for the fact that the children bully him and they appear to be wolves? And you see how this is a metaphor for the children of other religion. Children of other religion are called wolves. So this is a metaphor. The reason is because he is a Jew. The main reason is that he is a Jew, and they wish to target him and they hurt him, and they told me I had killed the Christ. And before I move on in this stanza, I also want you just to see how the poet has again changed his narration from third person to first person. Now he's saying I. He is using I. He is not using the third person he. He is not using this. So from third person in the second stanza directly we see that the narration has changed to first person. And he says, they told me I had killed the Christ. Now there are some things we need to know about the history of Jews and Christians. Why did the Christians believe or blame the Jews for killing Christ? Where we must write down a bit here for the purpose of reference, because it has a biblical reference. So I'm just going to write here. This is the reason for the religious animosity between Christians and Jews. It is because of the character of Judas. Judas is believed to be in the Bible one of the 12 apostles, or you can say disciples of Jesus. He was very close to Jesus. He was the one who was the close confidant and friend and devotee of Jesus, and he remained with Jesus all the time. So when Jesus was being sought by the Roman soldiers because they wanted to prosecute him, Jesus was there in a whole crowd. So he was there in a whole crowd. Nobody knew who Jesus was. They did not know him by face. So he could have easily been saved because they did not even recognize him. Those soldiers who were searching for Jesus, they did not recognize him. But Judas betrayed him. So it is written in one of the gospels, it is written that Judas agreed to betray Christ. He agreed to betray Christ for some 30 pieces of silver. So he was offered a bribe of 30 pieces of silver, and he agreed that he will betray Christ. So what did Judas do? In the whole crowd, when the soldiers with their swords drawn, they are searching for Jesus so that they could arrest him, Judas hugs him, kisses him, and says that you are my rabbi. So, what does Judas do? He hugs Christ, he kisses Christ, and he says, you are my rabbi. So, in this way, he gives an indication to the soldiers that this man is Jesus Christ. Immediately, Jesus Christ is imprisoned, and later on, he is crucified. So, it is Judas who actually culminates in the crucifixion of Christ. That is why it is believed by Christians that Judas was responsible for Christ's killing, and Judas was a Jew. So, because Judas was a Jew since medieval times, Christians and Jews have borne an animosity. Now, there are a number of versions of this story. This is the most believed version, but there are a number of versions. There are other versions also which say that Christ had actually used Judas, or he through Judas he had brought on his own crucifixion, because then ultimately he, with the crucifixion, he led to the atonement of the sins of man. अगर क्राइस्ट क्रूसिफाई नहीं होते तो मैनकाइंड के सारे जो पाप थे वो कैसे अटोन होते, वो कैसे धुलते? तो क्राइस्ट ने जानबूझ के जूडस को चुना कि वो उसकी अरेस्ट करवाएं और क्रूसिफिक्शन के थ्रू सारी ह्यूमैनिटी को Christ बचा सके. So Judas acted as a medium through which Christ brought on his own crucifixion so that he could save humanity. But बहुत सारे versions हैं, and what you need to know is why are the Christians so much against Jews? You have heard of anti-Semitism. This is the term that which is used for the hatred of the Jews. Hatred of the Jews के लिए ये term use होती है जिसे कहते हैं, and this is really historical and religious. So of course you understand why this poor little boy Nissim Ezekiel, as a boy, as a school child, he suffered in school, and he suffered bullying, and he suffered ragging, and he also suffered physical torture from these children who were Christians and who were from other religions, Hindu boys, Muslim boys. So he got beaten up by everybody. and he could not do anything about it. Now I am sure you would understand what kind of a frightening childhood, a horrible childhood he had. So he says, they told me I had killed the Christ. That year I won the scripture prize. But this one line tells us about the irony that this boy was so intelligent, even though he physically was not so fit, but he was intelligent. He won the prize of the scripture, of learning and answering questions from the Bible. So, can you believe those Christian boys who beat him up? Even they did not win this prize of answering questions from the Bible, the prize which he won. And this shows both the things, that he was intelligent also and he was very religious also. But the Christian boys, they tormented him, and he says, a Muslim sportsman boxed my ears. So there were boys who were physically fitter than him. He was a sportsman, definitely. He was very strong, and he beat him up also. So this is the kind of suffering and torture Ezekiel had to face in his childhood. These are real autobiographical elements in this poem. Moving on, the poet says, I grew in terror of the strong but undernourished Hindu lads. After telling us about the Christian boys and the Muslim boy as a Muslim sports person in the previous stanza, now he's also telling us about the Hindu boys. And he says, even though the Hindu boys were undernourished, they were also weak of bone, just like him. They were weak in physical strength, just like him, but they were still strong, and there was a terror. This strength can also be a strength in numbers, because they were so many and he was alone. And he says, I grew in terror of them. So his whole childhood is actually a tale of terror. He has been terrorized by the other children, children of other religions. And he says, their prepositions always wrong repelled me by passivity. And here this is some bit of humor that the poet has used by saying that not only were they strong physically, but mentally they were rather foolish, and they were not intelligent, because at least they did not have their grammar correct. So he hated them also, because he was repelled by them. Repelled means he hated them, uh, because they lacked the mental strength and intelligence that he had, and their English was also very poor. They had poor command over language. So this is a bit of a humor, that even though he was intelligent and the other boys were rather foolish as compared to him, but still he was beaten up and he lived in terror. And then he gives us a confessional statement, very confessional, where he says, he confesses rather, that one noisy day I used a knife. Here, noisy day can refer to the riots, because Mumbai has been a witness of a number of riots, and especially we have seen Hindu Muslim riots in the time when India was going to be independent. So when he was a growing up boy, he saw those situations when there were days of noise. So noisy days can refer to days of riot, days of violence. And he says, I also used a knife. There was so much bitterness and anger in him that one day he also became violent, he says. And then what was the consequence of becoming violent? The consequence was that his family believed that his morals had declined. So I'm reading this stanza. He says, at home on Friday nights, the prayers were said. Why were special prayers said? Because he had shown instincts of violence. He had picked up a knife. So prayers were said so that he could ask forgiveness for his acts of violence and aggression. So because he showed aggression, because he showed traits of violence, prayers were said on Friday at his home, and his family believed that his morals had declined. So he had to do something to correct it, and he took to yoga and Zen. And you can see how yoga is mostly associated with the Hindu religion. Zen is a Buddhist philosophy. So he tried to take corrective measures in all kinds of religious elements, in all kinds of religious practices like yoga, Zen, but unfortunately, he says he could not find any solution. He says, could I perhaps be a rabbi saint? What is a rabbi? A rabbi is a Jewish priest. So in his own religion also he tried to find answers. He tried to find solace so that he could become a better human being. But was it possible? Did he find any answers? He says, the more I searched, the less I found. So religion did not offer any solution. He was leading a life which was undesirable to him also, and morally to his parents also, to his family also. And when he tried to search for solutions of living a better life, not only in his religion, in the Hindu and Buddhist religion practices also, unfortunately, he says, I searched more, but I did not find any answers. So that is what is his state of dilemma. And that is why we say that this is a very confessional poem. This is a confessional poem. He does not hide anything from us. He it does not just blame others, because he says a lot about himself and his own mistakes also, and things that he did to correct his mistakes. From this stanza, we see that we have entered section 2 of the poem. This is section 2, and as I had told you before, section 2 refers to the adult age or the adulthood of the poet, and he tells us his age here. He says 22. 22 is his age. So now he's an adult, he's a young man, 22, and he says time to go abroad. And we all already know that he did spend some time in London, some years of his life in London, where he had gone to study, and this is the time that he is referring to in these stanzas. And he says 22, time to go abroad, first the decision, then a friend to pay the fare. So first of all, he says, I made the decision that this country was not where I wanted to live. This decision is not just to go abroad, but the fact that he wants to leave the country of his birth, and he is trying to find his life somewhere else. And he says, but then his parents could not afford that kind of a fare so that he could go to London, he could go abroad. How to go abroad then? He says, a friend to pay the fare. What is the meaning of fare? Fare is the pay for the ticket, or you can say pay for the carriage. However way he was going to London, through ship or by air, his friend paid the tickets. Philosophy, poverty and poetry. See the alliteration of per and per here. So the poet has used alliteration. You can note this down. And he says philosophy, poverty, poetry. Three companions shared my basement room. Of course, when he talks of basement room, we come to know that he was living frugally. He was living a frugal life. He was really not in that kind of financial position to live in a good place. So he was living in a basement room in London, and he had no companions. He suffered from loneliness here in India also, and now that he is in London, there also life has really not treated him well, and he is alone, and he has his poetry and his poverty and his ideas, his philosophy only as his companions. And he says in the next stanza, the London seasons passed me by. Now years and years in London are passing, even though he is studying over there, but he is really not doing anything fruitful with his life, you can say. He is not even enjoying his life. He has not found any friends or love there. And he says the London seasons passed me by. He did not enjoy, or he did not make himself useful. Basically, he had come to London because he did not find any meaning in his life in India. But did he find any meaning in London? Unfortunately, no. He says, I lay in bed 2 years alone, and then a woman came to tell my willing ears I was the Son of Man. Now, here, first of all, note that he is talking of 2 years. So, this is the time that he says he spent in London, even though in real life it was, I think, about 3.5 years that he had spent in London. But in the poem, he refers and he says that it was 2 years of loneliness in London, and then a woman came to tell my willing ears. Now, this is up to your interpretation. How do you want to interpret this line? He does not make it clear if this woman means the entry of love in his life, or is it just some kind of friendship. Is it maybe an older woman who is like a mother? We don't know what he's talking about, but he is at least telling us that this woman had an influence over him. She influenced him. She asked him to leave this kind of lonely life which he was living, because he was the Son of Man. And what is man supposed to do? Yaha, Son of Man, you can actually find two meanings over here. For Son of Man, you can actually refer to physical realization, that he was man, and a human being has his physical demands of the body. So maybe he is talking of a sexual affair with this woman, which changed his perspective. On the other hand, if you don't interpret this way, there is another interpretation of Son of Man, that man has been sent on this earth. He has been given this life for a purpose. This purpose is a big word here. It carries a lot of weight, and it carries a lot of meaning, because what he's saying that his life was going absolutely waste. It was purposeless. He could not find any meaning to it, and under the influence of this woman, he realized that he has been given this birth as a human being, as man, and because he's a man, he needs to find a purpose. So whatever way you want to interpret it, but the poet has left it open ended. It is up to the reader to understand. And he says, I knew that I had failed in everything, a bitter thought. And then he realized how life had been a failure. He was just lying there. His life was passing him by. Time was running away. He was losing the precious young years of his life. Remember that he's a young man of only 22, and in his 20s, early 20s. So he suddenly realized that he must do something with his life. His life was a failure, and it was a very, very bitter thought, he did not like the thought of it. And as you can see, I have also used one line from the next stanza because it continues here. If you can see, this is a continuity in this line, so I have used one line from the next stanza also, just so that to make the meaning clear, because it carries a continuity. So here I had failed in everything, so it continues. This is called a run-on line, where the meaning continues and makes sense only if you read the next line. So after this, we are going to continue with this stanza. And continuing the stanza, the poet says, so in an English cargo ship taking French guns and mortar shells to Indochina, scrubbed the decks and learned to laugh again at home. And as you know, it is in continuation to that bitter thought. So the London experience, the British experience, was bitter to him. It was definitely not a pleasant experience for him, and he says he decided to return. It was too much for him, and ultimately he decided to return. And to return where? To return to his own country, to return to India. And how did he do that? Now, please remember, this is actually what happened to Ezekiel, because he returned, and he returned on doing exactly what it is written over here. So he returned while cleaning the decks of a ship. So he returned via sea. So he cleaned the decks, scrubbed the decks of a ship which was returning to Indochina, and it was taking guns and mortar shells. So what kind of a ship it was? It was an English cargo ship which was coming to Indochina, and on it he traveled back home, and at home he learned to laugh again. So the bitterness of London is being contrasted. So you can say the bitterness of London is being contrasted to the laughter at home. Because at home, at least he was not alone. And you can also contrast the loneliness that he felt in London to the family that he found in India. So definitely when he came back to India, it was a nicer experience, a better experience than being in London. And in the next stanza, he says how to feel at home was the point. Now he says that obviously things were not all just good and wonderful for him when he returned to India, because the truth is that he still had a lot of struggle left. Coming to back to India does not mean he's going to live a good life now. He is not going to lead an expected life now, because he has nothing here. He has to start from scratch. And he says to feel at home, how to establish himself. This was the question. How to establish his life, his career. That was a big question. That was something, some point he need to think about. Some reading had been done, but what had I observed except my own exasperation? So he says that, see, I was an educated person now, because he had his degree in London. But then he says, even though some reading has been done, he has got some education. Yet, what lagged in his life was the confidence. He did not have the confidence to take up any job. He did not know how he is going to fare well in whatever career he takes. So basically, he's saying that I had only learned frustration. In London also he had dealt with frustration, and over here also he says the feeling of exasperation and frustration is the only thing he knows actually, and he does not have the confidence to do anything. And don't forget, even though he has called this home, this country home, and yet the feeling of alienation has not gone away. Please remember the paradox that this person feels. Being a Jew, he feels even like a foreigner, like a stranger, like an alien in his own home. So in his own country, he feels like a foreigner. So that feeling also has not gone away. Don't forget that. He has already mentioned that feeling from his childhood. It is traveling, even though he has come back. That feeling of being a stranger, an outsider in his own country, it has not gone away. And again, he comes back to the point of religion in the next line. And I'm reading, how to feel at home was the point. Some reading had been done, but what had I observed except my own exasperation? And here comes the point of religion, where he says, all Hindus are like that, my father used to say. And you will see how when he talks of religion, he talks of the actually the kind of a wall he feels, a wall between himself and the people around him. Who are the people around him? Of course, it is the people who are in majority. It can be the Hindus or the people of other religions also, maybe even Muslims also, but the majority of India's population is the Hindus, and he felt like a wall between himself and this majority, because he did not think like them, he did not behave like them, and definitely he did not feel like them. This is not how he had grown up, and this is where the whole problem lied. So we are moving to the next slide, where we are going to complete this thought of religion. And in this stanza, as you can see, and I am reading, he says, when someone talked too loudly, these are some of the characteristics. What are the characteristics that he thinks that he saw in the Hindus around him? So these are some of the characteristics of the Hindus that he saw around him. They talked too loudly or knocked at the door like the devil. Hey, they had no patience. They would just knock loudly, bang loudly, talk loudly. They hogged. Hogged means just like the hawker does in the street. जिसने अपना सामान बेचना होता है, जो गली में अगर कोई सब्जी वाला या कोई हॉकर जा रहा है, वो कैसे चिल्लाता है? उसने सामान बेचना है भाई. He is loud. And this, he says, all those people who lived in his surroundings, those people whom he met on daily basis, they were all loud and mannerless. And don't forget that he has come from London, so there is a clash between his Western experience and the Indian experience around him. What do you call it? We call it a clash. This is clashing in him. He himself has those very soft, subtle manners, and especially because he has been raised in a family like that. And then even added to it is the fact that he went to London to study. So he has that kind of mannerisms, very soft and subtle, well mannered. And when he comes back to India, he finds again those people around him. Some are illiterate, some are mannerless, they're just shouting, and he says they sprawled around. This is the kind of behavior. They were just lying around everywhere, so much of population, people shouting loudly, hawkers banging on the doors. This is not the atmosphere which really went down well with him. तो poet की problem देखिए, when he comes to India, he does not feel like the person who loves this place. When he goes outside of India, again he is a foreigner, because to those people he is an Indian. So he feels like a foreigner outside India also, and when he comes back to India also, it is all the same. And he says, I prepared for the worst and I am married. So this is again a little bit of humor that you will always find in Ezekiel's poetry. He has that sense of wit. So he says, when everything was going wrong to him, when everything was going wrong for him, what did he decide to do? He decided to do something even more wrong. And what was it? It was to get married. So it is just a joke. And he got married, and he says, I changed jobs and saw myself a fool. What does being a fool symbolize here? It symbolizes the lack of satisfaction. Did life give him any satisfaction? Did he feel happy? And the answer is no, because he says he changed his life. How did he say change his life? He changed his life by getting married. He changed his life by changing jobs. But unfortunately, none of this gave him any satisfaction. And he thought that he was just a fool because he was not happy with the life that he was living. It was as if he was a fool not to know what is going to make him happy. And then see how in the next stanza he talks of the life ahead. He says, the song of my experience sung, I knew that all was yet to sing. My ancestors among the castes were aliens crushing seed for bread. The hooked bullock made his rounds. And I want to explain this to you in detail, because this is actually talking about his Jewish ancestry. We already know that Jews were not the native people of India. They had come to India and they had settled in India many decades ago. So he says he also has that experience. That experience of his forefathers, of his ancestors, has not gone away. So this Jewish ancestry is what the poet talks about. And in these two lines, the first two lines, he says that he has the Jewish past behind him. It is as if he is saying that he has all the knowledge and everything that his forefathers had accumulated behind him. And when he talks of the caste, of course, he's talking of the Jews. Okay, so he says, my ancestors among the caste were aliens, and when he uses the word alien, it is not for the first time, because he has time and again called himself also an alien, and he basically says that he's a foreigner, just like his forefathers were foreigners crushing seed for bread. And this is the employment that they did, the meager job that they did, because they had to earn their livelihood. And they crushed seed for bread. For bread means to earn money. Okay, and what is this seed that he's talking about? This is basically the oil seeds that were crushed in order to extract oil. So he says the hooded bullock made his rounds, and just like a bullock is used by farmers for crushing, for drawing out water. So this was the kind of manual labor, just like the bullock does, that his ancestors used to do. So he is also summoning his past and his ancestry over here. And in the next stanza also, the poet continues with his ancestry when he says that, and I'm just showing you the next stanza. He says, one amongst them fought and taught. Now, who is them? Them, again, the poet is talking of his ancestors. He is not just talking of all his ancestors in this line. He is talking of one particular, he says, one among them. So, those people who had migrated from other places, they were foreigners, they were Jews, they came to India, and one among them fought and taught. So, he was a soldier, a major bearing British arms. And in which force had he fought? He had fought with the British army. So he says that they were, most of them just did menial jobs, manual labor, but one of them was also a soldier, and he told my father sad stories of the Boer War. And here also, this is a war which was fought by the farmers in South Africa, but you don't really need to remember much of this. What you just need to see, that the poet is referring to his past. He is referring to his ancestry, which is very important, because it is his Jewish ancestry which makes him the man that he is right now in the present. And he says that, okay, they did menial labor, but one of them was also a soldier. And he says, I dreamt that fierce men had bound my feet and hands. And sometimes he also has these nightmares. He has these bad dreams which trouble him, and they are violent dreams, and he does not know if these dreams might be just inspired by his childhood when he was bullied by children of other religions, like Hindu children, Muslim children. We have already heard about that. Or is it just some of those stories that that soldier had told his father, and maybe then his father had told him? So he says, I don't know, but my dreams were like nightmares. And then having dreams like nightmares is also very metaphorical, where it signifies the struggle that the person has in his lifetime. He is not living an easy life. We already know that he is a young man, he has studied in London, he has come back, but somehow he feels that his life has been a failure, because he has changed so many jobs. He has, even though he is married, he does not seem to be a very happy, satisfied man. The only thing that he's looking for has not come to him. That satisfaction has not come to him. And now the satisfaction, there is a hint of that in the very next stanza, because he tells us how he lands up writing poetry. So maybe it is the poetry which will ultimately lead to his satisfaction. And I'm reading the next stanza where he says, the later dreams were all of words. And he says, then when his life moved on, what he started dreaming of was words. And the words here definitely hint at poetry. I did not know that words betray, but let the poems come. When the poet says, let the poems come, he means to say that the now earlier he had dreams which were nightmares, but now his dreams are more related to words and poetry. Or maybe you can say that his dreams are inspire him to write poetry, and maybe this poetry is basically all of his dreams, his experiences, whatever he has experienced in his life. And this is exactly what we are seeing right now, because the poem that we are reading itself is inspired by his life. So this is not untrue with whatever he is writing here in these lines. This is not untrue, because the poet really confesses that whatever he is writing does not come from outside. It comes from within him, it comes from inside him. So he is in these three lines, that his entire poetry is a result of his experiences. So his experiences lead to dreams, and dreams lead to poetry, and lost that grip on things the worldly prize. And he says, now because I'm writing poetry, I have forgotten, or I do not care about the materialistic reward. Because earlier he is calling himself, he was calling himself a failure, and changing jobs, and he was basically looking for the materialistic reward, the money, or maybe whatever his job could give him. But he says, now I have stopped looking for, and lost the grip on means I have stopped looking for materialistic reward. I would not suffer that again. He says, I'm not working for materialistic reward, because what I'm working for is my words, my poems, and this is my only reward. So when we were talking of satisfaction earlier, I think this is where we get our answer, and this is where the poet himself has got his answer, that ultimately the satisfaction came with words. It came when he poured out his experiences through his poems. I hope this much is clear, because we are moving on to the third section of the poem now. So this is the third section of the poem, and when we say that this is the third section, we mean to say that in these lines the poet is talking about his old age, which can be called the last phase of life, because earlier in section 1 we have done his childhood, we have come to know something about his adult age in the second section, and now he is going to tell us in the last two stanzas about his at old age, which is the last phase of his life. And I'm reading, he says, I look about me now and try to formulate a plainer view. Definitely, when one reaches his or her old age, it is the time when one looks back at life, and then it is as if you are taking a third person view, an outside view on your own life. And I think it is when it becomes even more clear, it becomes even more plain, just like the poet is using the word plainer here. So he wishes to say, with the word plain, he wishes to say that it is a clearer view on his life. Now that he looks back at his life in old age, he says the wise survive and serve, to play the fool, to cash in on the inner and the outer storms. And see how the poet has used alliteration with the sir sounds in survive and serve. So definitely you can note down this poetic device of alliteration in between. He has used earlier also, and we see that now again. He says the wise survive and serve. So you can basically say that this is the conclusion that he has drawn from his life. And this is the conclusion that usually people come to when they are old. And what is this conclusion? He says that it is wise to share one's experiences as a poet and tell about their life and their inner thoughts, you can say. This is all about what you can call their experiences. So he says, I have come to the conclusion that in me this was wisdom. In himself he has always called himself a fool, but see how wise and fool, even though they are very extremely paradoxical terms, they are opposite terms, and yet he's using them together. That I was wise, it was a wise decision to become a poet, to survive and to write poetry. This is how I serve the society, because I cash in on the inner and outer storms. What are the inner and outer storms? These are the experiences that one carries in his heart, or throughout his life, the experiences that have come to a person. He says, I have considered myself wise, and now that I look back in my old age, I think it was wise to become a poet and write about all those experiences, the inner and outer storms. And people might consider him a fool, or you can say he is playing the fool. As a poet, an artist, a creator, he played the fool, but that was the wisest thing to do. So this is this, as we have come to know in the previous stanza only, this has brought satisfaction. The creativity, the writing of poetry has brought satisfaction to the poet, and this is what he believes in his old age also, that this was the wisest thing to do. In the next stanza and the last one, he has dealt with the issue of being an alien again, or the issue of whether he is an Indian or not. This is a big question. He had been dealing with it in his all two sections of the poem also, whether he's an Indian, whether he's an alien, whether he's a foreigner. How much of an Indian can he call himself, even though he is born here and brought up here? And maybe this is the question that he's trying to answer in the last two stanzas of this poem also. So the poet says, the Indian landscape sears my eyes. I have become part of it, to be observed by foreigners. They say that I am singular. Their letters overstate the case. So he is giving his own point of view as well as the point of view of other people who look at him, especially the foreigners. Okay, so he says, the Indian landscape sears my eyes. It burns. What is the meaning of the word sears? It means burns. So he says this is his relationship with India. Of course, it is not you cannot take it in the literal sense. It is his relationship with India as a country, as a society, as a cultural entity. How has his relationship been? It has been a bittersweet relationship. You cannot say that he has the most wonderful experiences in India, because he says it sears my eyes, it burns my eyes. He has had difficult, he has seen difficult times in India. He has dealt with the issues that a person of minority deals in a country where the majority is a different religion, and he himself is a part of a minuscule. Uh, they are really very low in number, the Jews. So he has dealt with those issues, the issues of alienation, the issues of marginalization, issues of being a minority. He has dealt with everything. So you cannot say that it has been an easy going in India. No, being an Indian has been tough for him. So he says, the Indian landscape sears my eyes. I have become part of it. And yet he says, yet he has accepted, because he has seen the world outside India also. He has lived and experienced societies outside India also. But ultimately, when he has come home, it is home. However difficult it might be, however tough it might be living in India, he has accepted being an Indian. So this is why we call it a bittersweet relationship. Ultimately, he is an Indian and he says, I have accepted that. But he has accepted that. What about the foreigners? What about people from outside India? What do they I'm sorry, outside India, what do they say about him? What are their views about him? He says that when the people from outside India, the foreigners, they observe him, they say that I am singular. They say that I am strange, because he is an alien in his own country. So, in this way, he becomes singular, he becomes strange, and he says their letters overstate the case. And yet he says they really don't know, because he believes that they are exaggerating. Of course, we know what is the meaning of exaggeration. When you actually give something greater value than it actually deserves. So in Hindi हम कहते हैं बड़ा चढ़ा के कहना. So he is basically saying that people who think that he is strange, being an alien in his own country, they are exaggerating his case, they are exaggerating his life, because now he himself has found satisfaction, he himself has found acceptance. So that doesn't matter. He says, it doesn't matter to me, and if it matters to other people, he just doesn't care, because he and remember, he is in the last section of the poem, and he is in the old age of his life. At this time, he has ultimately found the balance. You can say he has found the balance, but even though other people might call him strange, but he has found the balance of being an alien in his own country. And now we have come to our last stanza. This is the last stanza of this very important poem. And the poet says, I have made my commitments. Now, he says, now there is a kind of finality. When he talks of commitments, this is the final decision that he has taken about his life. He is confused no more. Earlier, we have seen him questioning. We have seen him feeling confused. But in the ultimate lines, he has attained that finality, that balance. That could be a good word. And he says, and amongst all the commitments that he has made, this is the most important: to stay where I am. Again, this is the assertion of his Indianness. He says, I am not moving anywhere. He says, I belong to India and I will stay in India, to stay where I am. And as others choose to give themselves in some remote and backward place, my backward place is where I am. So he is even answering those people who believe that India is a remote and backward place. And he says that this is as if who believe India to be unfit for the poet to live, calling it a remote and backward place. So this is what he says. If this is the backward place, and he says this is mine, at least it belongs to me. It is home. My backward place is where I am. And this is the ultimate line of belongingness. This is the ultimate assertion of his belongingness, where the poet says that I am telling myself, I am telling the world that this is where I'm going to stay. This is where I have finally found my home. And even though it might be backward or it might be remote, it might really not accept me fully. Okay, and yet this is my home and this is where I am. And this question definite this poem, I'm sorry, it definitely calls for discussion on the topic of identity, belongingness, Indianness, alienation, marginalization of minorities, and ultimately the search that an individual always has for what his life stood for, what his life will stand for, and what is his ultimate identity. The poet has been fighting for it. He has been dealing with this question throughout his life, and in the ultimate last paragraph and in the old age, actually, he has got the answer to his question. Whatever difficult relationship he has in India, this is his identity. Being an Indian is his identity. Even though in being an Indian is not easy for him, it is tough for him because he's a minority, and yet he has accepted. I hope you have understood this poem, and of course you have delighted in this a very important poem by Ezekiel. Thank you very much.